Okay. Now I'm in the middle of explaining why the new atheists are wrong when they say that Christians believe in fantasies, things they have absolutely no reason to believe are true. Now I've argued that the evidence of the universe and that supports the existence of God, the existence of an objective moral standard, that's evidence for the existence of God. And I'm in the middle of arguing that the existence of free will is evidence for the existence of God. And specifically, the claim is that it's more reasonable to believe that free will exists than to believe it doesn't. And it's more reasonable to believe that free will cannot exist without God than to believe it can. The existence of free will, as I was explaining last week, the existence of free will, it's a problem for atheists because they have no plausible explanation for how free will could arise in the purely naturalistic scenario that their atheism demands. I mean, what evidence is there that physical laws acting on matter and energy can create free will, that it can create a state in which beings act in a way that is not determined by those laws? In a mechanistic universe, how do you get to something that lives and acts in a way not determined by those laws? So they recognize this problem, and that's why many atheists argue that, well, I see that, but free will's an illusion. You don't really have free will. Human choices and conduct are in fact determined by physical laws, the effects of which are just too complicated, too complex to be traced out. But you're still, basically, you're a biochemical puppet. And I gave you many quotes last week from atheists asserting that. And here's one that I get it, on. And here's one, Jerry coined the end of one of his quotes that I put up, but I had a lot of people, a lot of atheists making that point that humans are merely biochemical puppets. And at the end of the last class, I said that this atheist denial of free will, that it leads naturally to the conclusion that humans are not responsible for their actions. I mean, being in essence sophisticated robots. So if I'm simply just determined, I'm just bumping around, I'm like a programmed, I just do what I do. Well, you can see how that gets in the way of holding people personally responsible because they're just a robot. Now, I want to show you show you some quotes from atheists that make that point. Now, here's Richard Dawkins in 2006. Richard Dawkins, right, the leading light of the new atheism. 2006, he writes in Edge magazine, "But doesn't a truly scientific, mechanistic view of the nervous system make nonsense of the very idea of responsibility, whether diminished or not? Any crime, however heinous, is in principle to be blamed on antecedent conditions acting through the accused's physiology, heredity, and environment. Don't judicial hearings to decide questions of blame or diminished responsibility make as little sense for a faulty man as for a faulty car?" Now, faulty, you see, it's spelled a funny way. That's because that refers to the British television program, Fawlty Towers. The character's faulty, and in one of these skits, he winds up beating his car because it wouldn't work. And it was funny because, you're holding this mechanistic thing responsible. You're beating this car like it has a choice in things. And he's saying, isn't it the same if we're holding people responsible? If he's a faulty person or a faulty car? He continues, "Why is it that we humans find it almost impossible to accept such conclusions?" I got an idea why. Why is it almost impossible? Well, it's almost impossible because we know from experience that we do in fact have free will. That's why it's impossible. You're trying to sell something that contradicts what I know. Okay, he says, why do we find it almost impossible to accept such conclusions? Why do we vent such visceral hatred on child murderers or on thuggish vandals when we should simply regard them as faulty units that need fixing or replacing? Presumably, Because mental constructs like blame and responsibility, indeed evil and good, are built into our brains by millennia of Darwinian evolution. Assigning blame and responsibility is an aspect of the useful fiction of intentional agents. You see, it's a fiction that we're really intentional agents. Is a useful fiction, is an aspect of the useful fiction of intentional agents that we construct in our brains as a means of shortcutting a truer analysis of what is going on in the world in which we live. And the truer analysis, according to them, is, you see, I'm a sophisticated biochemical puppet. He continues, my dangerous idea is that we shall eventually grow out of all this and even learn to laugh at it, just as we laugh at Basil Fawlty when he beats his car. Holding somebody responsible for murdering a child, when we grow up and are enlightened, we'll learn to laugh at that, just as we laugh at a guy beating his car when it won't start. He says, but I fear it's unlikely that I shall ever reach that level of enlightenment. That's very telling, and I'll say something about that in a second. Okay, so we have Dawkins there. That's Dawkins. Now, Harris, in his 2012 book, Free Will, Sam Harris, he says, look, in light of the fact our decisions are dictated by impersonal background causes, he then says we can no longer locate a plausible hook upon which to hang our conventional notions of personal responsibility. He recognizes if it's true that you're a biochemical puppet, which is his term, well, then how are we going to make you responsible for it? You see, we no longer can find a plausible hook on which to hang our conventional notions of personal responsibility. Victor Stenger, in 2012, he wrote, obviously, we cannot have a functioning society if we do not protect ourselves from people who are dangerous to others because of whatever it is inside their brains and nervous systems that makes them dangerous. Still, given that we don't have libertarian free will that sets us above causal laws, it would seem that our largely retributive moral and justice systems need to be reevaluated and maybe even drastically revamped. How are you going to hold people responsible criminally for doing something? Guy goes in and chops somebody up and eats them, and you got the nerve to look down on them and say you're doing something wrong and you need to be punished? Come on. He's a biochemical puppet who's doing that. They recognize that. Now, in the last sentence of the Dawkins quote that I gave, which I've italicized here, where he says, but I fear it's unlikely that I shall ever reach that level of enlightenment. See, he acknowledges that he cannot live consistently with the logical consequences of his position. He knows that he holds people responsible. He knows when his kid does something. He doesn't just turn around and go, well, you know what? You are a biochemical puppet. Even though I told you not to do that, well, what am I going to say? You're a puppet. He knows that he doesn't live that way and he doesn't act that way. You see, he holds people responsible despite the fact his atheism gives him no basis for doing so. Nancy Pearcey, she reported in her 2010 book, Saving Leonardo, that Dawkins was pressed on this inconsistency in his position at a book signing event. Young fella came up to Dawkins and he said, if humans are machines and it's inappropriate to blame or praise them for their actions, then should we be giving you credit for the book you're promoting? See, because he's out there book signing. I've written this book. Come gather around and let me sign your book. This guy says, should I be giving you any credit for it? Dawkins says, I can't bring myself to do that. I actually do respond in an emotional way, and I blame people. I give people credit. The young man says, but don't you see that as an inconsistency in your views? Dawkins, I sort of do, yes. But it's an inconsistency that we sort of have to live with. Otherwise, life would be intolerable. Otherwise, life would be intolerable. Now, you see, when somebody acts like that and somebody says something like that, you recognize that there is something inconsistent. The fact one cannot live consistently with the implications of atheism, just like Bertrand Russell admitted with regard to objective morality, where he says, look, I can't get around the argument, but I can't stand the idea that all that's wrong with wanton cruelty is that I don't like it. Okay, so he recognized he couldn't live consistently with the implications of atheism, but he wouldn't get rid of his atheism. Dawkins recognizes that he can't live consistently with this implication of his atheism, and the fact that they can't do that, that's an indication that atheism is false. It clashes with reality. You see, it's a sign unto your household. There's something wrong. And yet they just continue to push this and push this. In an interview that was posted online just a couple of days ago, Rupert Sheldrake, who's a Cambridge-trained biochemist and plant physiologist, he explains, he says, but materialists cannot possibly be consistent. They believe that minds are nothing but the activity of brains, and the activity of brains can ultimately be completely explained in terms of physical and chemical causation together with blind chance. In other words, free will is an illusion. This must mean that the materialist belief system is self-refuting. If a materialist were consistent, he or she would have to believe that his or her own beliefs were caused by brain activity alone. Materialist brains make them believe in materialism. But then how can they try to persuade others to adopt this belief on the basis of science, reason, and evidence if no one has free choice? So it's like I'm going crazy. I'm going, you think you're really an giant intellectual, and you can't recognize you're claiming you're a robot, and you're telling me, appealing to me by reason and evidence and logic, that I should change my mind? How? I'm a robot. I'm a chemical robot. What are you doing? But this stuff just goes right. That's why these guys say these guys are not really philosophers, you see. Last line or second, he says, by their own account, materialists cannot have adopted their materialist belief system by rational choice. Their brains make them believe it, and they cannot persuade others to believe it by science and reason. They can only pass on an infection. You see, so this is where I am on this free will thing. So quick recap where we've been on God's existence. Existence of the universe implies God's existence. Objective morality requires God's existence. And free will requires God's existence. And the next thing I want to assert or present to you is that it's more reasonable to believe that the origin of life requires intelligent design than to believe it does not. Now, the simplest imaginable single-cell organism would require such an astonishing level of integrated complexity that it is absurd to think that it could have arisen by blind, purposeless processes. That somehow you could get the insane level of integrated complexity that's necessary for the simplest living thing, that you could get that by, in essence, putting something in a bag and shaking it. Okay, it's just crazy. A cell's not some bag of goo that can be whipped up from a mud puddle. It's an amazingly sophisticated robot factory. It is a robot factory with a host of nanomachines that are performing an orchestrated ballet. It is absolutely amazing. And Honor would know more about this than 99.99% of the people on the planet. She's a cell biologist. This is the integrated complexity in this is absolutely insane. And I want to drive that home with quotes from some scientists. I'll start in 1974 with William Thorpe, who's a zoologist, and Thorpe says, the most elementary type of cell constitutes a mechanism unimaginably more complex than any machine yet thought up, let alone constructed by man. That same year, 1974, Carl Sagan, the atheist astronomer, he wrote in the Encyclopedia Britannica, Sagan says, a living cell is a marvel of detailed and complex architecture. Seen through a microscope, there's an appearance of almost frenetic activity. On a deeper level, it is known that molecules are being synthesized at an enormous rate. The information content of a simple cell has been estimated as around 10 to the 12th power bits, comparable to about 100 million pages of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Now, that's some serious information content. And this is in 1974. Michael Denton is a developmental biologist and a genetics researcher. I got 4 slides on this quote, but bear with me because it's worth it. Now, Denton wrote in 1986, he says, molecular biology has shown that even the simplest of all living systems on the earth today, bacterial cells, are exceedingly complex objects. Although the tiniest bacterial cells are incredibly small, weighing less than 10 to the minus 12 grams, each is in effect a veritable micro-miniaturized factory containing thousands of exquisitely designed pieces of intricate molecular machinery made up altogether of 100,000 million atoms, far more complicated than any machine built by man, and absolutely without parallel in the non-living world. To grasp the reality of life as it has been revealed by molecular biology, we must magnify a cell 1,000 million times until it is 20 kilometers in diameter and resembles a giant airship large enough to cover a great city like London or New York. Okay, so he's blowing the thing up so he can discuss it so you can get a picture of the complexity of it. He says, what we would then see would be an object of unparalleled complexity and adaptive design. On the surface of the cell, we would see millions of openings, like the portals of a vast spaceship, opening and closing to allow a continual stream of materials to flow in and out. If we were to enter one of these openings, we would find ourselves in a world of supreme technology and bewildering complexity. We would see endless, highly organized corridors and conduits branching in every direction away from the perimeter of the cell, some leading to the central memory bank in the nucleus, and others to assembly plants and processing units. The nucleus itself would be a vast spherical chamber more than 1 kilometer in diameter, resembling a geodesic dome inside of which we could see, all neatly stacked together in ordered arrays, the miles of coiled chains of the DNA molecules. A huge range of products and raw materials would shuttle along all the manifold conduits in a highly ordered fashion to and from various assembly plants in the outer regions of the cell. It would be an illusion to think that what we are aware of at present is any more than a fraction of the full extent of biological design. This is 1986. In practically every field of fundamental biological research, ever-increasing levels of design and complexity are being revealed at an ever-accelerating rate. And that has certainly been borne out. 18 years later, 2004, microbiologist Richard Stroman, he writes, molecular biologists and cell biologists are revealing to us a complexity of life that we never dreamt was there. We are seeing connections and interconnections and complexity that is mind-boggling. It's stupendous. It's trans-calculational. It means that the whole science is going to have to change. Let me see what we got here. Is it just a little thing of goo? Ooh. Not goo. Insane complexity. Integrated complexity. Richard Sternberg, who's an evolutionary biologist, those of you who saw the 2008 documentary titled Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed, he was interviewed by Ben Stein, and Ben Stein said, if Darwin thought a cell was, say, a mud hut, what do we now know that a cell is? He says, more complicated than a Saturn V. That's the rocket that did the lunar missions. You see, more complicated than a Saturn V. Alonzo Ricardo, he's a biochemist. He and Jack Szostak, who's a geneticist, they wrote in Scientific American in 2009, in an article titled The Origin of Life on Earth, they said every living cell, even the simplest bacterium, teems with molecular contraptions that would be the envy of any nanotechnologist. As they incessantly shake or spin or crawl around the cell, these machines cut, paste, and copy genetic molecules, shuttle nutrients around or turn them into energy, build and repair cellular membranes, relay mechanical, chemical, or electrical messages. The list goes on, and new discoveries add to it all the time. So you see that this idea that sometimes we get, cell pretty simple, it's not. To be alive requires an insane level of complexity, integrated complexity. These things work together in a ballet. And they have to work that way, or the thing won't be alive. Now, the last 60 years of intense research has brought the quest for a naturalistic explanation. I hope you know when I say naturalistic, I mean atheistic, no God, none of that. It's just all shaken out. Physical laws, matter, and energy over time. Just let them work their stuff, and all of a sudden, we come from nowhere out of nothing by chance. Okay, that's the naturalistic explanation. And they have tried 60 years of intense research. They've been on a quest for a naturalistic explanation for the origin of life, and they are no closer to an answer. Scientists have been knocking themselves out, trying to establish a plausible scenario by which life could have arisen without God. And though the propaganda, the PBS documentaries, the high school textbooks, the propaganda is that, well, you know what, we about got it locked up. You see, there's a couple of things to tinker around the side, but pretty much we know how it happened. Okay? Now that's the propaganda. But the truth is, they are as mystified as ever. Okay, now when I say something like that, I want to show you why do I say such a thing. So we're going to go back and we're going to start in 1962 with some quotes, and I'll bring you up to 2014. Here's the first one. Harold Urey. Harold Urey is a Nobel Prize-winning chemist and a famous origin of life researcher. He says in 1962, all of us who study the origin of life find that the more we look into it, the more we feel it is too complex to have evolved anywhere. We all believe, as an article of faith, that life evolved from dead matter on this planet. It's just that its complexity is so great, it is hard for us to imagine that it did. We can't even imagine how it's possible this could have happened. But we insist that it did. And if you say, no, it didn't happen because an intelligence, God, created it, that's not science. I said, well, you keep knocking yourself out. You keep thinking you're going to solve this thing this way, and you're not. Francis Crick, Nobel Prize-winning biochemist, he wrote in his book in 1981, an honest man, armed with all the knowledge available to us now, could only state that in some sense, the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. He had to throw in almost because he's committed to a naturalistic thing. But he says, almost a miracle. So many are the conditions which would have had to have been satisfied to get it going. Harold Klein, he was the chairman of the National Academy of Sciences committee that reviewed origin of life research. And he writes, this is in 1991, now 10 years after this statement by Francis Crick. The simplest bacterium is so darn, I substituted the word, he said something else, is so darn complicated from the point of a chemist that it's almost impossible to imagine how it happened. It's complicated indeed. Franklin Harold, he's a well-known biochemist. He wrote The Way of the Cell, published by Oxford University Press in 2001. And he says in that book, it would be agreeable to conclude this book with a cheery fanfare about science closing in, slowly but surely, on the ultimate mystery. But the time for rosy rhetoric is not yet at hand. The origin of life appears to me as incomprehensible as ever, a matter for wonder, but not for explication. Now, here's a guy writing a book who's a very well-known biochemist, published by Oxford University Press in 2001, and he seems to get it. Richard Dawkins, the leading light of the new atheist. He was also interviewed by Ben Stein. in that documentary Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed in 2008. And here's their exchange. Well, how did it start? Dawkins. Nobody knows how it got started. We know the kind of event that it must have been. We know the sort of event that must have happened for the origin of life. And what was that? It was the origin of the first replicating molecule. Right. And how did that happen? I've told you we don't know. So you have no idea how it started. No. Nor has anybody. Right? But don't be looking at me saying, oh, you got absolutely no reason to think this is true. You're just a crazy man. You're like somebody that thinks Nicole Kidman's in love with him when you've never met her. You're delusional. You're hallucinating. No. Freeman Dyson is a celebrated physicist and mathematician. And he wrote in his book in 2010, "The origin of life is the deepest mystery in the whole of science. Many books and learned papers have been written about it, but it remains a mystery. There is an enormous gap between the simplest living cell and the most complicated naturally occurring mixture of non-living chemicals. We have no idea when and how and where this gap was crossed." So there's Dyson, that's in 2010. 2010, Milton Wainwright, he's a molecular biologist. Milton Wainwright says, are we then getting any closer to an understanding of the origin of life, assuming it had one? As ever, there's much optimism that indeed we are making progress. On the other hand, it often appears as if the origin of life question has become bogged down in ever increasingly sophisticated organic chemistry. The reality is that despite the egos of some, the existence of life remains a mystery. It is not merely that biology is scratching the surface of this enigma. The reality is that we have yet to see the surface. Now that guy sees something there. He said, this is where we are on this. Kepa Ruiz Marazzo is an origin of life researcher, writes in 2010, "Our ignorance about the origin of life is profound, not just some simple missing mechanistic detail. We do not know how the genetic code came about. We do not understand yet how the specific sequences of proteins or nucleic acids came about in multiple identical copies. We do not have a precise idea about the structure and functioning of the first protocells. This ignorance stems not only from our experimental difficulties with prebiotic chemistry, but is also conceptual, as we are not yet able to conceive on paper how all these things came about. We can't even think about it. It's that complicated." John Horgan, this is one of my favorites. John Horgan, he's a science writer. Now, he wrote in February of 2011, he wrote an article in Scientific American he was reporting on a recent top-level Origin of Life conference. February of 2011, he's reporting on this top-level Origin of Life conference. He titled his report, his story on that article, February of 2011, his title is, "Psst, don't tell the creationists, but science doesn't have a clue how life began." Now here's the opening paragraphs of that article. "Exactly 20 years ago, I wrote an article for Scientific American that in draft form had the headline above, 'Psst, don't tell the creationists.'" He proposed that headline 20 years ago. And he says, "My editor nixed it. So he went with something less dramatic." And I remember this article, by the way. "In the beginning, scientists are having a hard time agreeing on when, where, and most important, how life first emerged on the earth." So the editor wanted to tone it down, this thing about don't tell the creationists. We can't have that. Okay, so he toned it down. He says, "That editor's gone now, so I get to use my old headline, which is even more apt today." Dennis Overby just wrote a status report from the New York Times on research into life's origin, based on a conference on the topic at Arizona State University. Geologists, chemists, astronomers, and biologists are as stumped as ever by the riddle of life. That's 2011. Now, Eugene Koonin, he's a very well-known molecular biologist. He writes in 2011, "The origin of life is one of the hardest problems in all of science, but it is also one of the most important. Origin of life research has evolved into a lively, interdisciplinary field, but other scientists often view it with skepticism and even derision. This attitude is understandable and, in a sense, perhaps justified, given the dirty, rarely mentioned secret. Despite many interesting results to its credit, when judged by the straightforward criterion of reaching or even approaching the ultimate goal, the origin of life field is a failure. We still do not have even a plausible, coherent model, let alone a validated scenario for the emergence of life on Earth." So you see that we wind up here with something like that. And he continues and he says, "Certainly this is due not to a lack of experimental and theoretical effort." I mean, they've been going after this hard. He says, "but to the extraordinary intrinsic difficulty and complexity of the problem. A succession of exceedingly unlikely steps is essential for the origin of life, from the synthesis and accumulation of nucleotides to the origin of translation. Through the multiplication of probabilities," you know, when you've got two probabilities, you have to multiply them, right? And so he says, through the multiplication of probabilities, these make the final outcome seem almost like a miracle. Now, that was a statement of Harold Urey in 1962, you remember? Wasn't it Urey who said that? Was it Urey or one after that? One of these guys saying very early on, this seems like a miracle. Maybe it was Crick. But now here we are, this is 2011. Almost like a miracle. In 2012, Addie Pross, who is a professor emeritus of chemistry at Ben-Gurion University, in his book, What is Life?, published by Oxford University Press, he says, despite the profound advances in molecular biology over the last half-century, we still do not understand what life is, how it relates to the inanimate world, and how it emerged. True, over the past half-century, considerable effort has been directed into attempts to resolve these fundamental issues, but the gates to the promised land seem as distant as ever. Like a mirage in the desert, just as the palm trees signaling the oasis seemingly materialize, shimmering on the horizon, they fade away yet again, leaving our thirst to understand unquenched, our drive to comprehend unsatisfied. Franklin Harold, who's the well-known biochemist that I mentioned, I quoted previously from his Oxford University Press book in 2001. Well, in 2014, he wrote another book, this one published by the University of Chicago Press. And he says, over the past 60 years, dedicated and skillful scientists have devoted much effort and ink to the origin of life with remarkably little to show for it. Judging by the volume of literature, both experimental and theoretical, the inquiry has thrived prodigiously. But unlike more conventional fields of biological research, the study of life's origins has failed to generate a coherent and persuasive framework that gives meaning to the growing heap of data and speculation. And this suggests that we may still be missing some essential insight. And I would say, indeed, they are. Indeed, they are. But they're never going to quit, you see, because by definition, they rule that possibility out as anti-science. So they'll just keep digging. They'll spin some story that's super improbable. Oh, but it could have happened. You go, and I'm supposed to believe that happened? Yeah, that's the best we have. That's it. It's either that or nothing. All right, so they'll keep going at it, and you'll keep reading stories. But this is where we are. Now, a major difficulty for all of origin of life scenarios, there are a lot of problems with it, but a major difficulty for the naturalistic origin of life scenarios is that the simplest imaginable cell would need to be able to manufacture hundreds of different kinds of proteins to accomplish the tasks that are necessary for life. The simplest imaginable living cell would need to be able to manufacture hundreds of these proteins. Theoretical estimates for the minimum number of genes, and thus the minimum number of proteins, They range, for a living organism, they range today from 200 to 300. This is what they think is the theoretical limit, that you'd have to have at least that many proteins in a cell for it to perform the functions of life. Now, the fewest genes of any organism that we know of is 525. And that's for the parasite Mycoplasma genitalium. And they did some studies on this one that has 525 genes, and they do knockout stuff and all this, and they determined that 382 of those were essential for the life of this organism. Okay, so that's 382. That's what we know. But they speculate that a hypothetical organism could survive, and we could reduce that and get it down below 300. But that's where we are between, say, 250, 300, something like that. That's where we're going on the thing. This is the minimum number, what would be needed. Now, what's this about proteins? Why do we have to have these? Well, proteins, they're the workhorse molecules of life. They're the workhorse molecules of life, and they take part in virtually every cell structure and activity. That's why you need them. They're the building material of the cell, and they do all sorts of work within the cell. Here's what zoologist Ann Gauger said in 2012. She says, proteins are the building blocks of life. They are the structural parts that give cells shape, the enzymes that build or break down the molecules of life, the motors that transport things, the agents that send signals and regulate the activity of other proteins and genes, and the morphogens that help determine the development of the organism. So you have to have these proteins, and the best theoretical estimate, 525 is the minimum of anything we know that's alive. We think that could survive with 382. They say, well, okay, but we think we can shrink that down to, say, between 2 and 300, 250, 300, something like that. We think we can break the 300 barrier. But still, you need hundreds of these things. You need hundreds of these proteins. Now, proteins, this will only look like it's complicated. It's not. Okay? The way I'm pitching it, don't be intimidated by this. Just bear with me. It's not. Proteins, the proteins are made up of small molecules called amino acids. You don't have to worry. Just amino acids, this is what makes proteins. They're like strung together like beads on a necklace. Okay? Here's a picture of the idea. This is the structure of proteins. Now, it gets more complicated. They have to be folded into a three-dimensional structure and all that. But just think of this as a necklace that has beads on it. A long necklace. Now, I say a long necklace because a protein can have anywhere from 50 to thousands of beads. Most of them have several hundred. Okay, so they're just a necklace, a beaded necklace of amino acids. All right, that's what a protein is. Now, there are 20 different kinds of amino acids that are used by living things. There are 20 different kinds, and the specific arrangement of these amino acids on this protein necklace, the beads got to be put in the right order. Just think of it like you have 20 amino acids they're used in living things. Think of it as an alphabet of 20 letters. We've got an alphabet of 26 letters, right? And we can spell out all kinds of things. Now, there's an insane universe of things that don't make an English sentence, right? You can arrange the letters of the English alphabet in ways that they're not an English sentence. Well, that's how these proteins are. The proteins, the amino acids, have to be strung together in a precise order for it to be a protein. Okay? And the kind of protein that it is depends on the order that you've arranged the letters in, the beads. But there has to be a specific sequence, or you get nothing. Just like if I randomly throw out 50 letters from an alphabet, is that an English sentence? No. So they have to be in a specific sequence. Now, we need hundreds of these things for something to be living. We're talking about spelling something correctly that's 50 to thousands of characters long, and the amino acids have to be in the right order. There's some play in that, which I'll talk about later. But just see it now. They have to be in the right order, or you get nothing. You get nothing, okay? Well, if the 20 different kinds of amino acids, if they have to be arranged in a precise order if they have to properly spell the protein for that protein to exist and for that protein to function. If that's the case, how do they get arranged that way? You see, how in the world do they get arranged that way? To spell out the hundreds of different kinds of proteins that are necessary for primitive life. How did that happen? How do the beads get strung in just the right order on the hundreds of different proteins that are needed? Now, to explain that or to talk about it, to reveal what's so difficult, I have to talk about how are these things arranged? What determines the order of these amino acids, the beads on that protein chain? How do they get in that specific order? Well, that's something that's determined, you see, by the sequences. That's determined by the cell's genetic material. You know, the deoxyribonucleic acid, the DNA, that we're all heard of. The DNA is what determines the order of the amino acids. Now, the DNA is made up of molecules called nucleotides, not amino acids. They're made up of nucleotides, and they are linked together. Just for my illustration, they're linked together. You can think of them as beads on a super long necklace. Okay? So just think of that. So we got proteins, 50 to thousands of amino acid beads strung. And you say, well, how do they get in the right order? They get in the right order because that order is determined by the DNA. And the DNA is a necklace of nucleotides that are strung together super long. Okay, well, what happens? How do you get there, you see? And actually, there are two parallel. The reality is there are two parallel necklaces that connect to form rungs of a ladder-like structure that's twisted. You see, you've seen this double helix thing. That's the classic DNA, right? But for my purpose, just forget that. You just like bust it open and just take one of the things and just think of them as beads on a necklace. Okay? Just think of it that way. Now, there are 4 different kinds of... Is that the bell? Did I just go off or am I imagining? I'm not. Okay. There are 4 different kinds of nucleotides that are used in DNA. So 4 different kinds. Let's just say that we've got 4 kinds. So each one's going to be a 1, a 2, a 3, or 4. Right? So we got 4 of them. 1, 2, 3, or 4. Now, the short answer is that the arrangement of those nucleotides, their order, whether we go, so each one's a 1, 2, 3, or 4, if we go 1, 4, 4, 2, 2, 4, like this, it is the sequence of the nucleotide arrangement that dictates the protein arrangement. So when it's time when a protein is needed, this machine comes into this double helix. And it comes in, now this is a machine. I'm not talking about where this machine came from, right? I'm at another level. But here comes this machine that comes in and unwinds this thing and races down the DNA. And it reads the sequence of the nucleotides, and as it does, it creates a tape that is coded to that. So it is taking the information from that and creates a corresponding tape of the order of these things. That tape is then taken by other machines, and it goes to another machine that then takes that tape and reads that tape and constructs from that tape the order of protein that takes, okay, here's the tape I got from the DNA, and so what's it calling for? Okay, give me amino acid 1, amino acid 2, amino acid 5, amino acid 20, and it constructs the protein from that tape that was generated by those machines. Okay, but that tells you, right, well then, the order then of the nucleotides, the 1, 2, 3, and 4, that has to be very specific. And what we're going to get to next week, Lord willing, you'll see that to just do a simple protein, you have to have, like at the bank, you've got a PIN number. Well, you got to go in and you say, I got to hit these certain numbers or I don't get anything. Well, to create the proteins, you got to have a PIN number that's like, woo! And that's the problem. You see, you can't get them arranged that way randomly. And there's nothing chemically that determines their arrangement. So something has to order them so that they're in the right order to go ahead and give them instructions to create the proper proteins. And you have to have that information for all of the hundreds of proteins that you need. I want you to see it because I'll give you some statistics on how insanely improbable that is. But I did hear that bell, and thank you for coming.